This is one of my very favorite folk clubs. You're a remarkable group, and I learned more at dinner tonight than you will learn from me, but it is always a pleasure. I think it fitting to begin with an Irish anecdote. This is about an Irish woman who lived in New York, an immigrant lady back around the turn of the century. Elephant got loose from the zoo and wound up in her backyard, and she called the police and she said, Officer, there's a great gray beast in me backyard. He's as big as me barn, and he's pulling up me cabbages with his tail. And the policeman said, Lady, you can't ask me to believe a wild tale like that. She said, oh, sure, and if you don't believe that, you'll never believe what he's doing with them. This is an illustration of just one plant and its extensive use, and we have good evidence for all of these things. If you don't have nails and screws and sticky tape and good glue, you have to tie your world together. And so the use of cord and rope is absolutely basic to survival for cultures that do not have iron. And there was an abundance of available plant material in Florida for making cord and rope. We have proof of the use of only 2 of the plants available, but having played with this, I think probably there are a lot more that we've simply not found. One was found at, actually 2, both were found at Marco by Cushing and at Wendover by Glendoran and his people. And they are palm fiber. It's not possible to assign it to a specific palm, but I'm certain, and most people agree, that the Sabal palm is the most likely since it's so very abundant. And the second is sisal, which comes from the agave, a century plant. That's the plant you back into when you're mowing your yard and puts holes in your backside. And these are some of the things that are made beside the cord from palm. Obviously, it's still used for thatch, baskets. If you split the stems of the palm leaves, it makes a very nice basket. Cord, rope, nets, lashing things together, and weaving. This is, you can take the fibers that are on the leaf split in between where these leaves separated and ply those into cord, or you can tear the leaves into narrow strips and about this, the width of a pencil head and ply them into fiber. Just the method. You either anchor it to a peg. You can hold it in your mouth, one end. You need to stabilize one end when you do this. If you hold it in your mouth, it makes you drool. And the other way is to hold it in your toe. This is, I've seen pictures of this from the Middle East, but it gives me toe cramps. So I generally anchor it to something and then twist it. You twist with thumb and forefinger in one direction, and in this case clockwise, and then you cross your wrists in the opposite direction, in this case counterclockwise, and the 2 forces cancel each other so that when you turn loose, the cord does not come unwrapped. A second fiber that the palm yields is an interesting stuff. There was wild cotton in Florida, but we have no evidence of its being spun or used. There is a need for a fiber that's like cotton, and in the young sabal palm, At the point where the stem meets the tree, there's a diamond-shaped opening, and this stuff is easily pulled out. It's quite soft in the young trees, can be spun into cord and into rope. Makes a very nice rope. It hasn't got a great deal of strength in the 2-ply form, but if you double it, twisting and crossing wrists in the opposite direction, you get a 4-ply cord, which is quite strong. And I have examples up here you can play with when we're through. We had a lecture, Bill Marquardt had a lecture series about 8 years ago, and one of the lecturers was Teddy Roosevelt's great-granddaughter, Anna Roosevelt, who's an archaeologist who's been studying in the rainforest, and she was talking about the use of fiber by the people in Brazil. And she held up a tuft of this stuff and she said, "Tampons." There was a little thud of silence, and then she went on with her lecture. Interestingly, Spanish moss, of all things, if you put it under water for a couple of weeks and let the succulent outer living portion ret away like you would ret flax to make linen, you get a black, curly, hard, tough fiber which can be applied into cord very nicely. And the inner bark of several trees makes extremely strong cord, remarkably strong. Mulberry is a good example. Willow also works. You simply peel the bark off and then scrape the outer bark, which is scaly and easily dislodged, and then tear it into narrow strips and ply it. It's a little bit stiff, but it's extremely strong. This is the agave, the century plant, and it is the source of sisal. And this is a nice fiber. If you pound it and clean the soft tissue away, you get a nice straight white fiber. And if you leave the point attached to the leaf and cut back a strip out of the center of the leaf, left attached to the point, then you clean it and ply it, and you get a very nice needle and thread attached already to the needle, and it sews very nicely. These are just pictures of some of the fibers made into cord and rope. And I decided to do a presentation for the Florida Anthropological Society on making cord and its breaking strength. And this is how I did it. This is messy. There was water all over the floor. But you make a clamp and you hold the cord between two clamps lined with rubber so they don't cut it. Put a bucket on the end and then add water until it breaks. You put that green block pretty close to the bottom of the bucket, otherwise it goes all over. And then you weigh the bucket, the cord, and this gives you a pretty nice indication of how strong the stuff is. And I have a table here which indicates that mulberry bark is probably the strongest. 1/8-inch mulberry bark was able to sustain 35 pounds. It's not as strong as nylon, but it is remarkably strong and remarkably useful. After I learned to make cord, and I learned to do it at the staggering speed of 3 inches a minute when given all the ingredients lined up. It would take, I estimated, to make a net to catch mullet, it would take me about 2 1/4 years. It's clear that the women who did this, and we think probably there was a lot of this plying going on because they had need of such enormous amounts of cordage, particularly the coastal Indians with their fishing technology. But anyhow, after I learned to make the cord, I decided to try weaving. This is some, for gosh sake, honest to gosh, woven material from Florida. This came from a 7,000-year-old Wendover site. It was preserved in the muck in that incredible preservative medium, anaerobic, no oxygen, neutral in pH, no bacteria, which has preserved the bone and plant material absolutely beautifully. And even when the skulls of these phenomenally preserved skeletons are opened, about, I think the total was 90 human brains were still intact. The brains were checked with an MRI, with microscopic slides, x-rays. You can see the architecture of the brain on the MRI. So I made a loom, the world's most primitive loom, and I used for a warp the vertical cords, the sable palm leaf fiber, and for the weft, the sable palm trunk fiber, and produced a strip of about the ugliest, stiffest, and scratchiest cord you can imagine, fabric you can imagine. My daughter suggested I wear it as a loincloth, but I told her I thought I'd pass that up. In the maritime culture, Florida's got a whale of a lot of coastline. Nets were important because you could harvest a whole bunch of fish. And from the stuff that we found on, that Cushing found 108 years ago on Marco Island, we know that they had small mesh nets in which they caught things like bay anchovy and killifish, that they had nets that were just the same mesh size as the modern day gill nets that were used here for mullet prior to the net ban. The knot is the same as the knot we use today, the sheet band. The net gauges, and you can't make a net without a net gauge because it makes your squares uniform. It's essential. And the net gauges were made from the plastron, the flat side of turtle shells, and from large conchs, mostly bussicon, the lightning whelk. This is some honest to goodness Marco Island cord. Age, not really, we don't really know, but my guess is about 800 years old. And the mesh, I measured the mesh size and examined the knots, and sure enough, they're just like that we use today. Here's Bill Marquardt making a net. The net gauge there is red mangrove, and that's what the fisher folk in this part of Florida used because it's such a very hard wood, so smooth, polishes so beautifully, low friction, and lasts forever. This is what their mullet nets looked like, very much like today's nets, weighted on the bottom with shells and buoyed on the top with cypress pegs and gourds encased in a little net. Today's materials are nylon monofilament, lead weights, and plastic floats, but the principle is the same. And here are some sketches by an artist from the University of Florida, and this shows what the nets in action probably look like. They must have taken good care of these things. The net tends to rot. I made several pretty quickly if you leave it outside, so they must have sheltered it. They must have washed the salt water out. Maintenance of the nets must have been extremely important. And here's Merrill Clark, that artist from the Archaeology Department, University of Florida, Florida Natural History Museum. And this is a very nice picture of the net in action. Baskets are great fun. And the reason I embarked on all this replication of prehistoric crafts was because writing the book, Florida's First People, I kept coming on questions and nobody had an answer. How hard was this to do? How long did it take? How readily available was the material? How strong was it? How long did it last? And so forth. So I decided early on that I had to do it myself just to answer these questions. So I and my family and friends replicated most all of the things you'll see and hear about tonight, including tasting the foods that they ate, which I don't much recommend. This is another honest to God and about the only basket. This also came from Wendover. This is in that incredible muck, 7,000 years old. And we know that baskets were made also because the impression is on the inside of pottery, so that the basket was woven inside the pot, and the markings are very clear. You can tell the weave, size of the weavers, and so on. If you want to do it, you just take a palmetto leaf and the stems come pretty long. You can actually get one that's about 6 feet long if you have a robust palmetto that's growing where it has to put a stem way up to get the light. And you simply split in this fashion. This is all in my book. And then these are baskets that are woven from the splits called splints. And my baskets are quite crude and quite ugly, but they certainly illustrate the fact that you can do it. Here's one made of the split palmetto stem. And the weaver here is sabal palm root. The root of sabal palm, you can pull up 10, 15 feet of this from a tree that's down and washing out in the water of the Gulf. The weaver is supple, is very difficult to break, bends over short radiuses very nicely. Makes an ideal weaver. And there's a basket with finished. And this is a basket made by my friend Dick Workman in Fort Myers, who wrote the book Growing Native. And this is 40 pounds of rocks, and this was a burden basket that he made, and it works just great. It's amazing how strong these things are. Well, this and pottery were the hardest of the things that I tried, and I do indeed take my hat off to the fire makers of a pre-phosphorus era. This is, I'm sure that some of them could make fire by twirling the spindle with their hands, between their palms of their hands. And I've actually seen it done, but I can't do it. And it's extremely difficult to do. So if you use a bow drill, which is what I'll show you here, you can use a softwood for the spindle, softwood for the fireboard. As you see there's a handhold up top, then the spindle, the bow, fireboard. Spindle spins rapidly as you move the bow. And there's the process. On the far right, the fireboard has just begun to smoke. My big toe is in considerable peril. You have to have your tinder all ready. Then when you get a coal, you tease it into the tinder, and this fiber from the sabal palm makes very good tinder. And then you fold that up gently around the glowing coal, blow on it, and you better have a fire laid and ready. it's not easy. It's tiring. Everything has to be bone dry. The woods have to be proper, soft woods. We found that willow as a spindle and cypress as a spindle worked well. And for the fireboard, it was less demanding. In this case, we were using poplar, but basswood also works well. This was the way these folks got around. Florida is a wet state, and before the civil engineering that made it possible to build the roads and to drain the swamps in Florida, it was largely covered, at least intermittently, by water, mostly fresh water. And there weren't any roads that were worth a darn. Paths were intermittently submerged and constantly overgrown. And so the dugout canoe was a logical solution for this. Lee Newsom from University of Florida and some others did a study of the shapes, and the ones that you have here, the one that you have here apparently most resembles the bottom one, which is for rougher water. It has a bow that's elevated. I understand it's 40 feet long. This is a long canoe. This must have been a war canoe. Anyhow, they are almost all made of pine. Now the Seminoles made their canoes out of, and still do, make them out of cypress. And cypress is a good choice. It's straight, nice straight trees, softer than pine by a bunch. But the thing is that the Seminoles have steel tools, and you can't gouge worth a darn without steel. And so the choice for the Aboriginal Floridians was the pine, the yellow pine, long leaf, and slash pine. And they burned the heartwood, resin impregnated heartwood, out, and it burns great, as you know, fat pine it's called, and leaving the lighter sapwood. And if you burn out the heartwood carefully so that you don't burn up your gunnels, you get a suitable canoe. We tried it. It was a project. Our tree was only 17 feet long, and let's see, there were 4 of us, and it took us 8 months working on weekends to do this, but it was most informative. The replicative archaeology is really interesting because a lot of things you learn, you just don't even think about unless you've done it. This is one of those debris engravings showing them doing the very same thing. In this case, they're cutting their trees down by burning, putting a fire around them. I expect that to be very slow. We used a chainsaw in the interest of time. And they fanned it with palm leaves, which we did to see how well it worked. And they scraped it with shells, scraped the char. And here we are beginning. We would build a fire and then carry the coals over and lay them on the log. We used dams of wet clay to protect the gunnels and parts that we did not want to burn. And here we go. The hole is, the interior is getting deeper. And we fanned with palm. But you know what? The thing that really makes this burn is a leaf blower. Again, we tried the prehistoric method, but in the interest of time, and it took a long time anyway, we did use some modern tools. Anyhow, there it is, finished. It was perhaps the ugliest canoe ever made. My wife named it the Ugly Mother. And here we are launching it. And it held 2 people and 2 cans of beer and had 3 inches of freeboard. But we could paddle it. The glue available to these folks was organic, and it is, one of them was certainly pine rosin, which is the resin after it sets up, but it stays pretty brittle. It's sticky as a mischief, and it's hard to get off your hands. And if you don't have turpentine, and I presume these folks did not, it's a mess to use. It works fairly well. It's kind of like epoxy in that it doesn't contract much when it sets, but it takes a long time to set up, and it's, if you get the dried rosin off the pine tree, you can melt it in a little ceramic bowl and then ladle it onto your material to be glued and let it harden. I don't think much of it. It isn't really very strong. The other thing that I believe they must have used, and the evidence for it really comes from Frank Hamilton Cushing's writings, and he described on many objects a gum-like and insoluble size, which is very suggestive of a latex. There was a native, at least arguably, a native ficus rubber tree here, the strangler fig, and if you tap it in the same way that latex is tapped from the rubber tree, you get a nice trickle. I used a pen shell here as a funnel and a ceramic bowl to catch it in. Then if you add to it various pigments and dyes, and for pigments we used powdered shell for white, powdered charcoal for black, shell plus charcoal for gray. For reds we used red clay, and also marl berries, which grow on barrier islands, and also pokeberries and grapes. Interestingly, the pokeberry, not the pokeberry, the grape and the marlberry are like litmus paper. They are a fairly bright red, but if they come in contact with alkaline material, in this case if we mixed a powdered shell with them, they turn blue. And so many of the masks that were found by Cushing have simply got black, white, gray, and blue. And I wonder, since these masks were found on shell mounds, which have an abundant source of alkaline, if they weren't originally, if the blue wasn't red. This is pure speculation. And we don't know that they use latex as a binder for their pigments, but by golly, it works very well. These folks were consummate artists with wood. They carved some beautiful stuff, and I share the view of Cushing and his artist Wells Sawyer, that the beauty of many of the artifacts produced by the Calusa was due to their use of shark teeth for tools. And shark teeth come in many sizes and many shapes. They have a very sharp edge, a smooth edge, a sawtooth edge, a convex edge, a concave edge. They don't work like steel knives, but once you get used to using them, they do indeed work. And we find the grooves from shark teeth on many artifacts, particularly those from Marco Island. So they were certainly used as scrapers, and by golly, they used fossil shark teeth too, because we have drilled Carcharodon megalodon teeth. That's the big giant white shark, extinct white shark. And we have mako, and both of those are extinct. And we have hemipristis, which is the one on the lower left side, and it's curved very much like a saw. Makes a very nice saw. Here's some of the masks these are watercolor paintings done by Wells Sawyer, the artist for the Cushing expedition, immediately after they had been washed from the mud and before they began to fade. Almost all of Cushing's stuff degraded tragically because they had no method of preserving it. And he refers many times in his writings to the failure of water glass, sodium silicate, shellac. He tried all the things they knew, but in these water-soaked wooden artifacts, nothing worked. And today we use things like polyethylene glycol and other things that bulk the cells and keep them, preserve them. That's one of the masks. That's at the University of Florida Natural History Museum, which has eyes made of shell. And as you can see, it's badly warped and shrunk. These were almost all made of gumbo limbo, which grows on barrier islands. Here's some of the pigments. In order to powder shell, you have to heat it and turn it from limestone into lime, from calcium carbonate into calcium oxide. Otherwise, it's just too hard to powder, but it does powder nicely then. And then there's a yellow-brown clay, red clay. There's actually a greenish clay, greenish-blue clay. Grape juice gives a nice purple, and powdered charcoal, intense black. We made our brushes from chewed palmetto stem. Worked well. And there's pokeberries on your right, grapes on your left. Okay, let's talk about the food. If you look at the shell mounds, you're overwhelmed by the thought that these folks must have eaten one god-awful amount of conchs, clams, oysters, scallops. But they didn't just eat oysters, and if you look at the midden, you find mixed with the shell, in many areas, thousands of tiny fish bones. Their chief protein source was probably fish, and it may have been their chief caloric source. Anyway, here's just a overview of, this is live oak acorns, and all over the southern United States in the late summer, actually in early summer until late summer, depending on how far north you go. And these things fall, and on good years they fall by the millions. They can be eaten out of hand from the live oak. They're not toxic, and they are insipid. They're not crisp, they're not salty, they're faintly sweet, and they have very little flavor, but they are nutritious, and they were used in various ways, including making a sort of acorn pudding, which I tried. It was horrible. And they did eat the fiddleheads from fern and the tips of smilax vine, greenbrier vine. They taste very much like raw green beans. Sea grapes, of course. Sea grapes are mostly seed. They're pretty astringent, but they're not bad tasting. They're a little bit sweet. Prickly pear, you have to be careful with these things. They leave thorns in your lips. Mulberries were fine. They were just great and delicious, and they were native. The wild grape is an unappreciated delicacy. It I think, is more tasty than most of the big cultivated grapes that we eat today. Its only problem is that the ratio of grape to seed is about 50-50, and so it's very difficult to spit the seeds out, particularly if you turn them into raisins by drying them. It's almost impossible to get rid of the seeds. These are elderberries, and a week ago, a paleoarchaeobotanist gave a talk at Pineland in Fort Myers, and at Windover, where this spectacular bone preservation was found, one woman had several thousand of these seeds in the area of the abdominal cavity, thousands of them. She also had advanced bone cancer and was probably in considerable pain. So Lee Newsom, the archaeobotanist, said she thought probably they were eaten for their medicinal properties. What those properties are, I don't know. But this woman had sure eaten a bunch just before she died. These are blueberries, which we had here. These are persimmons, wild persimmons. Do not confuse these with the big, luscious, semi-transparent, cultivated persimmons. If they're dead ripe, you can eat them. If they're anything less than dead ripe, they're just hell. They do terrible things to your mouth. These are the roots on the left of smilax, on the right of water lily, and both contain starch, but these things are the mischief to process. They are tougher than heck. The smilax roots are just almost like wood, and it has to be pounded, and they have to be soaked. The starch is insoluble, so if you pound it enough, the grains come loose and settle to the bottom. And then some of them have to be actually fermented before they're safe to eat. They did eat them. There's good evidence that they did, but man, what a job. Grass seeds, yes, they probably boiled these into a sort of a gruel. In one of the finds in Europe, there was a pouch of these, not the Iceman, but a similar well-preserved find, and it contained a spectrum of seeds. And so one of the television companies did assembled all these seeds together and boiled them up to make a porridge. And the newscaster said it was probably the most horrible porridge he'd ever eaten. Again, they are good sources of carbohydrate and some protein. Corn in North Florida, in Central Florida late, but really down here past Alachua, there wasn't very much corn. It was grown, as you see above, we think, rather than in close set rows. The corn looked a lot like today's corn, except it was kind of irregular. Today's corn is a hybrid and has to be crossed. Two different cultivars have to be cross-pollinated in order to get the hybrid corn we eat today. And this stuff was, these kernels were, of course, eaten and roasted in a fire, but they were also dried and soaked in wood ash lye. If you add water to the ashes of your fire and then drain the water out, you get potassium hydroxide. And if you soak your corn in the potassium hydroxide, you get hominy. And if you don't soak your corn in potassium hydroxide and you have dried corn, and you put it in a mortar, we know they made mortars and pestles, even if the mortar is made of hickory, which mine was, and the pestle made of hickory, and you pound the dried kernels, they fire all over the room like bullets. And they're just almost impossible to grind into flour. You have to have stones or steel mill. So this is probably why wood ash lye was so extensively used to soften this material. Once you've softened it, you can let it dry a bit, then you can crumble it into fine particles, making grits. and crumble it and dry it, and then even parch it over a fire, and it makes very good, it lasts very well, makes good food for traveling. And parched corn was used extensively by travelers. This is the Ilex vomitoria, the ingredient for the black drink, which we all know about. This at least was one of the ingredients, and there were probably others. If you want to make the black drink, you pick the leaves, it's a holly, and use the early green leaves, much like tea, and then you boil them, you parch them first in a ceramic bowl, then boil them. And I used a shell here, and because I was wondering, I knew that the Calusa extensively used shell with the columella removed, the whorl, the central whorl, and I wondered if you could cook with it. By golly, you can. I cooked with this shell 5 times, boiled tea, and it didn't injure it appreciably. So this would have been a very good pre-ceramic cooking tool. Anyway, the species name of this stuff bothered me a lot. Vomitoria did not sound like something I wanted to try, but I had resolutely tried everything up until that time, and so I got up my courage and did drink some. It's bitter, really bitter, but not impossible to drink, not as pleasant as tea or coffee, but it really gives you a caffeine buzz, has a really high caffeine content. Did they use alcohol or hallucinogenic drugs? Well, alcohol takes some sweet fruit and fermentation to make wine. There's not a whole lot of sweet fruit around here. And there was, however, a mushroom here that has psilocybin in it, which will give you, by God, technicolor, three-dimensional hallucinations. But we have no evidence that either were used. And finally, like any good chef, I have left the best to last. This is the fruit of the palmetto, and this was widely used, widely described. We sent some off to IFAS in Gainesville, and they checked it for nutritious content, and it has some protein, a good bit of carbohydrate, and some fat. It's quite nutritious. The FDA tells us it does not help with prostate problems a bit. They did a study. But it tastes probably the most awful of all the things I tried. You all, I'm sure, are familiar with Jonathan Dickinson and his epic. He was shipwrecked on the East Coast near Sebastian, and in 1696, he was a Quaker. He and his wife and 8-month-old baby made the trip north from island to island, and finally wound up in St. Augustine and ultimately in Philadelphia, where he became a merchant and was very successful. But this trip was harrowing. Some of the tribes that he encountered were friendly, others were fairly hostile. The women nursed the baby when his wife's milk failed, and they all 3 made it. He describes eating palmetto berries. This is a topic you may know a good bit about, and some of you may not. It's about a young man whose name is James Kennedy. He lives in Vero Beach, and he found a bone from a mammoth about 4 years ago, left it in the drawer where it stayed until he washed it off about 2 years ago, and I use this when I talk to students in universities. Florida archaeology is not only not boring, but has unearthed some of the wildest, most incredible stories, totally beyond, some almost beyond belief. And this is a very poignant tale about a young fossil hunter who's, I think, found this thing scuba diving in a canal, and on it was the etching of a mammoth, and it is unmistakably a mammoth. Everybody who saw it initially said fake. It's got to be fake. We don't have anything like that in this country. And that etching looks a whole lot like it was copied from the caves and carved ivory in France and in Germany. Barbara Purdy looked at it and said, well, it's worth checking out. And so I think she talked to this group. It has stood up to a pretty rigorous bunch of tests. Here it is outlined so that you can see precisely. And here are some of the cave drawings from Europe. And here is our Vero mammoth superimposed on the cave drawings. And this bothered me a good bit because there's a great deal of similarity in style. But it may be that if you have a sharp instrument and a bone, there is only one way to draw a mammoth. In any case, this thing has stood up to fairly rigorous testing, including X-ray spectroscopy, rare earth element analysis, which gives you an idea of its age and the layer in which it was found, scanning electron microscopy, and examination by the forensic anthropologist, who said that the bottom of these scratches was the same color and character as the edges, as the top of the bone. It did not show any sign of being put on there recently. Margins of the scratches were not sharp, and he felt that there was no question that this thing was authentic. Barbara Purdy labeled it then the oldest and most spectacular and rare work of art in the Americas. This thing is 10,000 years, like nothing we've ever found. And he's going to auction it. I've been trying to find out when the auction will be. The date still has not been set. The auctioneer is contacting museums and collectors all over the world. And it's worth following. This guy's in his 30s. He's scarred from fire. He's not terribly bright, and he wants $1 million. The University of Florida tried to buy it for the Florida Natural History Museum. One of their patrons offered him, I think, $70,000, and then went up actually to $120,000. He turned both down. So this is an ongoing story, and that completes my lecture. Thank you.